Good morning. My name is Connie Nguyen. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Racing Commission, and we are here today to conduct a advisory committee meeting on proposed rules and rules. These include rules that have tentatively been filed as well as rules that have not been filed yet. The members of the committee include Connie Erickson, who is here for OTOBA, Commissioner Barry from the Racing Commission, Commissioner Fowler from the Racing Commission, Dave Nelson from the Quarter Horse Association, Randy Bodine from the Horsemen's Group, and do we have Linnell on? Linnell from OTOBA, and Alice Lombard, our contract veterinarian for us and a veterinarian with her own practice. Dr. Alice Lombard, Dr. Jeannie Manhart, also a veterinarian and someone who contracts for us, Dr. Everman, our primary veterinarian for the state of Oregon. And do we have Jack Root on?
I think Jack's out of town. I think he's at
Okay.
a veterinary meeting.
I thought he was going to make it. It doesn't sound like he was able to. So those are the members of the committee. Anyone else that's on, you're welcome to listen in. I think we only have one or two other people that are on. But for the portion of this meeting that we're going to have until public comment is opened up, you will not be able to speak.
Connie, this is Linnell. Did you put Connie Erickson in my place?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Linnell, you can't talk.
Thank you. I'll be quiet now.
Okay, shut up, Linnell. No, I'm kidding. This is, we have a lot to discuss, and many of these are very complicated, very personal decisions that we're making. And I know that there's a lot of different views on these. The way I'd like to do this is to go through one rule at a time, have all the people on the committee give their views on it. If there's any back and forth afterwards, we'll go through that. And then we'll open up to public comment at the end of each individual rule, so it's not as confusing. Does that make sense? Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we have the rules up in front of us and we all know what we're hopefully looking at. Unfortunately, I've been on Zoom all morning. Now I have to change what I'm on. All right. Hopefully you're all looking at the Oregon Racing Commission form agenda. Is that correct?
It's okay here.
Okay, so we see the agenda. We have 4 rules to talk about. These are in different places. Some of these have not been seen by anybody other than this group. Others have already been tentatively filed, but we still will make amendment and move forward as necessary. The first one we're going to talk about is the starting gate. I'm sorry for making you dizzy by scrolling through this. All right. The change that we have in here is that the starters shall ensure all assistants. Oh, is Mike Twiggs on? He's also a member of this group.
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Thank you, especially since this is your rule. The starting gate shall ensure all assistants are properly trained in the safe and appropriate handling of horses, including but not limited to leading, packing, heading, and tailing procedures. They shall also ensure the use of tailing bar for wrapping tails, if equipped, is strictly prohibited. I'm going to go ahead and go around to everyone. First, though, I want to say that Rod Lowe, who was unable to come to the meeting, asked me to mention that he was concerned about this because he thought the tail bar should be used as long as the tail wasn't actually wrapped around it, as long as it was going through. only one time. So I put that out there as his comment. Let's go ahead and start with Connie Erickson. Do you have any opinion or concerns about this?
Well, I have a question. You say that Rod wants the tailing bar, but wrapped only once. Now, what do you mean by once? Is that once completely around, or just on basically maybe under the bar and hanging on to the tail?
That's why that was the impression I got, is under the bar and holding the tail. Maybe, Mike, we would need more clarifying information on that.
I would agree that the tail comes over the tailgate, down behind the wrapping bar, and then pulled straight back, but not wrapped completely around the bar.
Right. Well, I think that's important, not to wrap it around the bar. But I can certainly see how being able to hang on to it can be helpful and a safe job for horses alike.
Well, and if I might add that, all the years I worked at the starting gate, I never used a wrapping bar. I just would tail either up or straight back over the tailgate. However, you still risk, anytime you tail a horse back, the situation like we had at Grants Pass, where if a tail slips down in between the V of the starting or the tailgates, it could still cause a problem.
Right.
So, this wrapping bar issue is, I'm on the fence with it, because I know that the risk remains with or without the wrapping bar, So when
never,
you tail a horse back, you want to tail him back to a certain angle to where you don't risk dropping it down in the V, if that makes any sense.
yeah, I've never been at the back of the starting gate, so I've never seen this apparatus. So I guess actually I'm not competent to have an opinion.
Right, let me go on to the next person. Randy Bodine.
Yeah, so I mean, I discussed this with Rod, and I'm going to just stick with what he said. It's one of those things where once you take something away, it's gone, kind of a deal. But again, Rod has much more expertise in this area than I do, so I'm going to go with what he told me and the same thing he told you, Connie.
Okay, works for me.
All right, Dave.
Sorry, I have a problem with the language in
Wait,
red in
wait.
this.
Hang on, Dr. Everman. I'm going to get to everyone as we go through, so hang on until I get through everyone.
All right.
Thank you. Dave.
I've never heard of a wrapping bar, so I would not have any comment.
All right, great. And then Dr. Everman, go ahead.
Well, I have two problems with this. The way it's written, people could do the same thing on the tailgate handle if there was no wrapping bar present. Like the gate they have at Grants Pass now, unless they remove them, they have a separate wrapping bar on the gate. But people generally don't use that. They use the handle. And I agree with Mike that the effectiveness of holding the tail on the horse to keep it from sitting down is basically by holding it up, taking it over the gate and down and around anything, even one time, is really diminishes the effectiveness of what you're trying to accomplish. And having this, the way it's written now, it sounds like if it's not equipped with a wrapping bar, that you could wrap it around something else. In general, should just be prohibited.
Okay, so I think that's a good point, and if nothing else, we need to say that, well, we'll continue on that. That's a good point. I appreciate the fact that you've clarified that they can wrap it on other things beyond the tail bar, and that we should clarify that if that's going to be part of it. Dr. Manhart.
I agree with Dr. Everman that they wrap on most anything and they need to hold the tails up to keep them from sitting down. To prohibit the tail bar, it's more in the training and proper, safe and appropriate handling methods than that the equipment should be banned. Yeah, I would have trouble totally banning it.
Okay, Dr. Lombard.
I think I'm in the same boat with both the other veterinarians. I think the verbiage needs some finessing, but I think the intent is very good.
All right, then we have our two commissioners, Commissioner Barry. Any concerns or thoughts on this? And do you have
You
any
know,
follow-up questions for the people who have talked already?
on this one, I'm just kind of listening and learning. This isn't something I'm really familiar with. If somebody could give me a clear description of exactly what the wrapping process is like, that would be helpful.
Mike,
Well, I've never used a wrapping bar. I mean, this is new to me. I didn't even know they were installed. So my understanding is that you're using it for leverage. So if you brought the tail over the tailgate and then down behind the wrapping bar, if you will, and then pulled straight back, it might give you a little more leverage, but I'm not sold on that idea because I always tailed straight back, so,
So this is for getting a horse that thinks back is the way to get out of an uncomfortable situation from going back, is what I'm understanding. Is that right?
well,
Or
from
sitting
flipping up.
down.
Sitting down, but he'd be sitting when he sat down, he'd be sitting against the actual tailgate, correct? He wouldn't be able to get down to the ground, or would he?
Well, the idea is when you tail a horse back that, you got the leverage because the tail's going over the tailgate.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can only go so far up without creating discomfort.
Sure.
And-
Okay.
So they come, theoretically, they come back to you, as a handler.
Commissioner
young horse-
Barry, a
oh.
horse can flip in the gate, so basically
Mhm.
going all the way down, and that's what they're trying to prevent.
I see what you're saying. So a horse that's rearing up, you're lifting the tail to say, "Hey, get your front end back down."
Right.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, Connie. That was very clarifying.
And go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Any other questions, Commissioner?
No, I still don't understand what, like Dr. Everman said, I'm not sure what the advantage to wrapping a tail would be from a leverage standpoint. Now that I understand what you're doing, just pulling the tail straight up seems like the thing that you do to keep a horse from rearing in a situation like that. So I guess I don't really understand the advantage of the bar as it's being described, but I haven't seen this before, so I wish I had a video of it or something. It'd be a lot easier to.
Well, maybe I can clarify it. When you tail a horse up, you're trying to put him up into the V. You're
Mm-hmm.
putting him forward up into the front doors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when you're tailing a horse back, that's preventative, trying to keep him from flipping in the gate.
So that helps.
There's a little bit of a difference there.
I see.
And
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead and get through everybody first before we open up to
Oh,
questions.
sorry.
all right.
Except for Mike, because this is Mike's verbiage that he's been working on. One more person, then we'll open up to everyone. I just don't want us to step all over each other, which I'm really good at, by the way. Commissioner Fowler, questions, concerns, comments?
I don't have any concerns. I just would comment that I appreciate everybody's information on the topic because it's something that I don't know a whole lot about either. So that's all I've got. Thanks.
All right, now you guys go ahead and go at it. Other ideas, concerns? Connie, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Mike because, like I say, I've not been at the back of the starting gate. So so when you lift the tail up and it puts the horse up in the front of the gate, is that preventative of anything besides the horse backing up? And then the second part is to prevent a horse from flipping. Is it the pressure of the tailgate that you're seeking to make him think that he's contained and not able to rear up?
Okay, people will have different opinions, but with my experience, and I worked on the gate for a lot of years, tailing up, you're pitching that horse forward, and that's to help them break better, you know, to get a good break. When you tail a horse back, you're over the tailgate, and so as that horse rears up, now it's putting pressure on the tail because you're over the tailgate, and so it brings them back to you. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. I appreciate that clarification.
I want to ask something too, kind of, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, like this only applies to like horses that are, most of the horses that come in that are going to be a problem in the gate are known to the gate crew. And if the horse just goes in the gate, stands there nice like he's supposed to, none of this even comes into play. It's just
Right.
The horses that are known to misbehave come under this whole situation.
Well, a lot of horses, you know, you cock their head to you just a little bit to where you got one eye on you and one eye down the track. And then when the gates pop, you just toss the head. And yeah, and it doesn't come into play unless you've got a notorious horse, you know, a bad actor. And that's when you rely on a tail.
It seems to me, Mike, and I might be wrong, but from what I've witnessed is sometimes it's the younger horses that are more likely to need this. The
Oh,
2-year-olds
I
that
don't
don't
know
have as
about
much.
that. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes no. Sometimes, you know, old campaigners can, you know, they've been there plenty of times and they get excited because they know it's coming. That gate's gonna pop and you're gonna have a rider hollering and a whooping and a, you know, sticking. And yeah, they get excited. So I don't know. Sometimes I never really saw a difference in the age so much. It's just, oh, bloodlines and things like that, maybe more so.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is the consensus, and let me know if you don't agree with this. I'm hearing the consensus, other than my dog saying that she hears something, is that we want to clean this language up a little bit. And I think I have some people I sent it out to clean up. So it's clear that if they are to use anything, it's only the tailing bar and they shouldn't be wrapping it around anything. Is that basically what we're agreeing with?
Yeah, I might add one more thing. I can't imagine anybody wrapping a tail around the lever of the latch because that's just going to pop the gate open. So I can't imagine anybody using that latch as a wrapping bar. But I mean, you know, I got no problem with tweaks in the language if everybody wants to go there. So.
Any other questions, comments, or concerns? Yay, we got through one. Now we get to the tougher ones. Medication and prohibited substances. Okay, there's a couple different things on here. The first is the use of bute. The way that we had this written up is that we would go to 48 hours. And we have the what that would be in testing. I know that testing was a big concern on this one. A lot of people had concerns about testing. One thing I mentioned is we could change these percentages as an idea. And again, if you weren't involved in the previous discussions, the reason we are recommending 48 hours, and Tom, you're gonna be the expert on this one, so you're the one that they ask questions to, is because that would potentially alleviate a horse from maybe they got their medication 24 hours before their race, which is at 9 o'clock at night, but the vets check in at 9 o'clock in the morning, so their injuries are potentially still being masked. Did I explain that right, Tom?
That's correct.
And this also has stacking, to make it simpler, instead of having all of this, stacking violations may occur when 2 or more non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs are presented at detectable levels. All other non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs are not permitted. So let's go back in the same order. We'll start with Connie.
Oh, okay,
Hey,
I
Miss
was,
Easy Dr-
I was, looking, do we have a, first off, general question. How much does this, whole section line up with HISA's rules?
Tom, you're the boss now.
Well, it's extremely close to what Heise is recommending. The one thing I would change on this is that I would change the 0.3 micrograms per mil to 0.5. The reason for that is almost all of the horsemen in Oregon are giving the bute themselves, and they're giving it orally. And these numbers are based on a single intravenous injection 48 hours before a race. And our people are basically giving it on a daily basis. And if they give it orally on a daily basis up until 48 hours before the race, they may easily be over that number at 0.3. So 0.5 just gives a little bit of leeway there. If they give it at 24, they'll be way over. So it should accomplish the same thing and give a little bit of leeway.
Connie, what other questions do you have?
Okay, just a minute here. Okay, so the LASIX administration going down
Yeah,
to
let's
200
go through this. Let's go through this part first to make sure we've got this
Oh,
one
okay,
clarified.
okay, fine.
Sorry, it's in the same
Sorry.
role, so that makes
Yeah.
sense.
No worries. So we're talking only about butte and about stacking. We're obviously not allowing stacking. And I think doctor's recommendation is probably a good idea because we really don't want to penalize people unnecessarily. We want to get the bad actors, but we don't want to penalize people unnecessarily. So I'm pretty good with this.
Mr. Randy Boding.
Yeah, so I still have a problem with this. I don't think 48 makes total sense. I mean, the only science that we've been shown here was what Dr. Lombard put out on when she did her presentation. And it clearly showed that up or down with bute had no, numerically recognizable impact on catastrophic injuries one way or another. And so I question if what you're doing here is actually doing what you'd like to think it is. And I know the horsemen aren't going to like this. I mean, I can tell you that right now. I mean, so I guess I'll just leave it at that. I think 3 to 5 is a good idea from Dr. Everman there because of the fact that he is absolutely correct when he say orally. So that's a different thing than the injectable. So again, I can't really move off of my objection to this. I just think it might be closer to HISA, but I'm not sure why we want to be moving closer to HISA since we're not going to be a HISA track anytime in the foreseeable future, unless we hit a windfall of money that I can't imagine. So, yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. I don't agree with this.
And just to clarify, this has nothing to do with HISA. ISO may be close to these standards, but the reason why we came up with this one is because we think that it may help with the morning pre-exams. Dave, your turn.
Well, I agree with that, what Randy just said. I don't see that, I understand what HISA was trying to do, and it didn't have anything to do really with horse safety, but more or less with the ability to market Kentucky horses in Europe. I don't know that I've ever seen any deleterious effects on horses from the current rule. And I think I happened to be around for several years during the hay oats and water time, and I don't see any great advantage over if you're going to do this narrow a revision, that we just ought to go back to hay oats and water.
Okay, and we're on to the veterinarians. Let's start with Dr. Everman. If you have any comments on it. It's your bill, other than what you've already mentioned. Otherwise, we'll go on to Dr. Manhart.
Yes, I think that the main advantage, first of all, on Dr. Lombard's letter that she wrote to us, I don't think that was very well controlled as far as showing a cause and effect. So I don't think that was a reasonable limitation or quantification of what effect bute has on catastrophic injuries. Basically, I'm of the opinion this is mainly, like Connie said, about the pre-race examinations. If a horse needs bute, we had over 90% of all the horses that ran at Grants Pass were on bute, and most of them did not need it. So it's unfortunate that when it's given at 24 hours, everyone thinks that, we're a high percentage, I should say, believe that if someone else is using it, they should use it too, because it might be of some benefit. And oftentimes it's not of any benefit, but it may interfere with our ability to do a pre-race examination when the horse has had it 12 hours before we do the examination. And I'd welcome other people's opinion on this.
Dr. Manhart.
Tom has certainly pre-raced more horses than I have, but I have a concern about the 0.3 micrograms because of the variability in horses' metabolism of bute, that even some horses you'd stop it at 48 hours and still have a higher test just because they can't clear it out of their system, especially if they're doing chronic bute usage. I don't know. I mean, I did the track back in the hay oats and water time almost, and I don't notice a difference between injuries or not as far as that, but my experience is way more limited. That I am a little bit worried about the 0.5 horses not clearing sometimes. So
you said the 0.3 and then you said the 0.5.
I mean the 0.5, but I still am a little concerned because horses are variable clearance out of the liver.
All right, so we're back into Dr. Lombard.
And I'm in the same boat with Dr. Manhart. We know that horses metabolize things very differently. We also know that chronic use of bute, they build up metabolites in their system, which means that they will continue to test positive at higher levels or test at higher levels. But the metabolites themselves are not what is quote unquote doing the job, not the anti-inflammatory part of it, but it will show up in the horse's system. And I think going from 2 to 0.3, what we're gaining there is the ability to get horsemen in trouble and potentially have horses running listed on bute that don't have any metabolite in their system because the horsemen are trying too hard not to be over the limit. And my point, and I apologize if it wasn't clear to Dr. Everman or anybody else, of my data from my last document that I provided to you guys, was that there are too many factors to say that lowering Butte is actually going to reduce our catastrophic breakdown rate. We did lower Butte and we actually had more catastrophic injuries. I'm not saying that had anything to do with the Butte, but I'm saying the Butte change wasn't helping. But I do agree with most of what everybody else has said is the 48 hours is something that I strongly believe, especially with the timing of our post times and our pre-races, that 48 hours should be enough to make it so that when we do our pre-races in the morning, we're seeing what we're seeing from the horse that's at least 24 hours out from getting Butte, not sometimes 10 or 12 hours out from getting Butte, where they could be masking some things, but changing the actual values in the law from 2 to 0.3 of Butte, I think is just not doing any good and potentially just causing more trouble.
And as a follow-up to both Dr. Manhart and Dr. Lombard, if 5.5 is too low, what is your recommendation?
I say don't change it. Leave it at 2.
Dr. Manhart.
I would have to study it. I don't know. I don't know what the average would be.
Okay, Mike Twiggs, you're next.
Give me just a second. I got to plug in my computer.
Okay,
add
we're gonna
one
go
thing?
on. Go
Tony,
ahead,
can I add one thing?
please.
I talked to the director of the laboratory at University of Illinois, Chicago, and we are the only track jurisdiction that they test for that uses the 2 microgram limit. Everyone else is significantly below what we are.
That
So,
text there, they're primarily HISA lab, yes.
yes, primarily, but they do, for example, they do us. But
But there are plenty of other states in the nation that are higher than.
yes, I realize that.
And again, let's just keep it to who's got the floor right now. We'll have open discussion after we get to the commissioners. And with that said, since Mike isn't here, can we please go to our commissioner, Commissioner Barry?
Thank you, Connie, our Director Wynn. I hear a lot of arguments for why the NSAIDs are not harmful. Does anyone have any arguments for their benefit to the equine athlete? Or the jockey for that matter?
So up to all, this is their turn to ask you guys questions.
Okay. If no one has an answer to that question, I really don't have I guess I just question what is the benefit of giving horses Butte. That's my main question. We can argue about levels all day long. I think that's the smaller question. I think the larger question is what's it doing for the horses? Is it doing anything good for them? Whether or not it's harming them, what's like Dr. Everman said, most of the horses on it probably aren't benefiting from it.
Well, it's anti-inflammatory, and we do all get wrapped up in the orthopedic side of it quite a bit. But there's a lot more to that. And when we get to Lasix, we'll maybe talk some more about inflammation in the lungs that can actually predispose horses for bleeding and other catastrophic things that can happen that way, and overall muscle well-being. So not just the bones, but the muscle health and our tendons and ligaments, just generalized anti-inflammatory. And I know some people don't believe in it when they go for a run, but let me tell you, when I go for a long run, I'm taking an anti-inflammatory and I come back the next day more wanting to go for a run than I did if I hadn't taken my Advil. And happy and healthy horses are important.
Commissioner Fowler.
I guess I'd like to follow up on the doctor's comment. You take an Advil, you're more likely to want to run the next day, and that's because things aren't hurting. But it seems to me that when things are hurting, an athlete should back off so that there then wouldn't be an injury. And so
well, and I think for me personally, It's more when I come back at the end of the day and I'm not sore, even if I'm not sore the next day, even though I'm not currently on the Advil that day, we forget that these horses are also living creatures with, I mean, if you come back sore every day, are you going to even want to go to the track? Is it fair to make these horses want to have a rider thrown on their back every day if they're unhappy? They're still living creatures. Like, we get into the minutia of their joints or their lungs, but I can tell you, happy horses are safer and they are more willing to do things. And when there are horses who aren't happy going to the racetrack, that's when I worry about them more. Horses will tell you
Yeah,
they're not happy to go to the track.
I appreciate that because I too want happy horses racing. Are there, for a horse that's taking bute after every time that they exercise, so I'm gonna just say, let's say a horse is taking bute 5 times a week during their time they're training and racing, are there long-term effects that need to be considered of,
Well, and I think
like, is that
Dr.
hard on
Everman
their organs?
I think Dr. Everman touched on this a little bit before. I worry much more about our banamines and our ketaphones, which are in our regulations that we're looking at right here, than I do about the bute. There are some indications of stress-induced ulcers, which can be GI ulcers, stomach ulcers, that can be made worse from chronic use of bute. And that is a concern that we talk about. I will say in the horses that we scope, it does occur when we stick an endoscope down there and look for those lesions, we will see them, but it would probably be the exception, not the rule. But I'd have to look at the numbers, Dr. Everman.
Well, I think that the housing at the racetrack and the age of the horses really predisposes them to gastric ulcers, and the use of the nonsteroidals certainly exacerbates that a little bit.
And I'm just gonna make my comment since it's open. You know, I think that there is a lot of horses out there that are taking a lot of bute that do have ulcers, just like there are a lot of people that are taking too much ibuprofen who have ulcers. We all know that ibuprofen or any of those can cause ulcers, especially they're more likely in certain people. I also think that I take a leave when I'm sore after I run, but if I break my leg, I don't have to be put down. So those are a couple considerations. Are there any other comments from anyone that hasn't made them or additional follow-up comments?
I have a comment sort of on a personal level, and I direct it toward Dr. Everman. I'm in favor of bute being used judiciously. I'm not in favor of just random bute or bute all the time. And one of the reasons I say this is because I currently have an ankle that's fractured in 2 places. I'm not wearing a cast. I'm working in the barn. I have a really nice limp going. And I took an NSAID yesterday in the barn because my ankle hurt so much I could hardly bear it. And pretty soon it felt pretty good. And I could have easily made a step that would have aggravated that injury because I was feeling as good as I was. So I'm concerned about any of the NSAIDs being used inappropriately because I want all my horses to come home and have second careers.
Any
So-
other follow? Oops.
Well, I was kind of hoping that
Well, I think that's a good point, that we don't want these drugs to be overused and only used when they are necessary. And certainly no horse should be racing that has to have NSAIDs. Now, if they wanted to give it after the race, when they're not subject to the stress of racing, I think that'd be fine and might help the horses recover from the race. And I think a lot of trainers already do that. So that would probably be a good idea, but having over 90% of the horses getting NSAIDs prior to racing and having them in their system listed in the program as being on bute is probably just not a good idea.
All right, I think we've hit all the points on this one. I think if I were to recap, the majority believe that the 48 hours is a good change. There may be some need to make some change in this number I to a 0.5 or something else. If anybody can show me a good research on why 0.5 isn't good, I'd love to see it. And I think everybody's okay with the stacking. Have I missed anything? Otherwise, I'm going on to the next category.
I would just add one thing that, you know, whatever the stakeholders decide, I'll of course enforce. But I would, you know, if we're going to make a drastic change in these rules, I'm going to argue for a grace period and a little bit restructuring of a penalty grid, you know, and that's really all I got to say about it. Whatever the industry wants to do, that's what they want to do, and I'm good with it. But
Okay, and I'm going to add to that we will also undertake a heavy-duty communication plan to get this information out as quickly as possible. That's one of the reasons why we're pushing to move through this as quickly as we can on some of these, so we have enough time to make sure that everyone that we possibly can reach is aware of it.
Could I add one thing, Kyle?
No, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I do think a grace period is a good idea because of the variability that Dr. Lombard pointed out. The horses do metabolize bute and other non-steroidal all drugs really at variable rates, and the trainers don't necessarily know what their horse does with the oral administration. So if they were to come out and be at 0.8 or something, if they know from our educational standpoint that they cannot give it prior to 48 hours preceding a race, then I think we'd be fine with that, but we should have the grace period also, so that if a horse comes out at 0.8 and they say, look, I gave it orally 5 days in a row and the last day was 2 days before the race, then they need to know that before they get penalized.
Can I
Yes,
add
Al.
to that?
Go ahead.
The concern with that, which I think that's good, the concern with that is in order to know that your horse has to go to the test barn once that year. So how long does the grace period go? If your horse is running second or third, you never know because it never went through the test barn. So it's a
I
very
think
small
other people
sample.
get that message out to people pretty quickly.
Well, I think to Dr. Everman's point, it was commenting on the individuality of certain horses.
Well, I think we could have the grace period easily extend to the first time first penalty the person would be subject to, and that would be up to Mike. But if we give Mike the flexibility, I think that he would be able to manage that pretty easily. We didn't have that many violations last year.
Well, I add in too, and I agree, having kind of a tiered penalty would be, I think, a good idea, because somebody who is 0.6 and that's what their horse does versus somebody who is a 2, then there's a big difference between that. And so having a tiered penalty, I think, and a grace period would be a good idea.
That's a good point.
Are we suggesting that this tiered penalty or grace period or mulligan or whatever we're calling it, that would go on indefinitely, or that would be, say, for the first season that this rule was changed, and then that it would go away after that?
probably a little of both. I mean, we've run into this before, and I think Dr. Alice remembers this, where some people were taking advantage of the grace period and their numbers were actually going up while everybody else was coming down, trying to get into the new parameters. So, you know, you got to be cautious about how you approach it, so that you don't have, individuals taking advantage of the grace period and, putting the screws to the other horsemen who are actually trying to comply.
So
Correct me
making
if
sure
I'm
that it's,
wrong.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Dr.
Correct me
Lombard.
if I'm wrong, Mike. I think what we ended up doing, because that happened a few times, is the grace period really was only if you were between the old higher level and the new lower level. If you were above the old higher level, it was a violation. Forget the grace period, right? That's kind of how we.
Right,
did that.
right. But you still had those people that would, make that attempt. Yeah. So,
Gosh, so careful wording when it gets put on paper.
And I want to bring up one thing, which will answer Dr. Lombard's. You had brought up some other medications which we shouldn't have. Our rules are pretty clear that if it's not listed, they can't have it. So I think we've already addressed that. All right, and
Can I say something about that?
sure.
So the difference is with the bisphosphonates, they don't test very long in the system, but they have a very long-term effect, which is why both in HISA and in several other jurisdictions, they have itemized that as something like we did with the shockwave, or we're proposing to do with shockwave, is because it's not necessarily something that you're going to come through the test bar and test positive for. Now, if you do, obviously that's already a violation, right? It's already something else than what they're allowed to have in their system. But this is actually saying, no, you really need to be in whatever everybody decides, but the recommendation is to kind of match what Washington is, which is 6 months, and to regulate it to only be used on label, which is for horses over 4 years of age, which is when the label says, because younger horses, it affects their bone metabolism in ways that can be catastrophic long-term in the horse's bone structure for life, really. So that's why the bisphosphonates is different.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and have a discussion about that. Let's go to the other doctors since we starting with the doctors this time. Dr. Manhart.
I don't have enough experience with that, but it does make sense to have it stand alone as far as what you're using or not using.
Dr. Everman.
I think this is mainly going to come up on the postmortem examinations, where we can ask the laboratory at Oregon State to submit materials for evaluation on a postmortem examination, because on a blood test or a urine test, if it was given a month ago, it's not going to test positive. So
UC Davis can do the hair test on it now. And
on
it's test for 6
the
months.
hair, yes,
Yes.
but that's not typically done on all of our horses. We do blood and urine on the winners
Right.
of races.
And we do hair on quarter horses, and it could be something that we should discuss with maybe stakes races and thoroughbreds if we're really going to do bisphosphonates. I think it's a valuable thing, and I think it is a bigger contributor to catastrophic breakdowns than is paid attention to. It's recognized. Weak bones should not be running that fast.
You could be right. I'll just get Connie to pay for that and we'll be good with it.
Okay, so let's open up to anybody else who's not a doctor now.
Well, what I have read, this is Connie Erickson, what I've read regarding the phosphonates definitely says it's bad for young horses. So I'm 100% in favor of keeping it out of the systems of young horses.
Is there anybody opposed to that? All right. That will come on a different bill, or I might be able to edit this.
Well, Connie, one of the things we need to do regarding bisphosphonates is to have a conversation with the laboratories about what specimens they would need to test for this, and also whether or not we want to pay to do hair on the winners of races to make sure they're not on bisphosphonates. And certainly at the postmortem examinations on any catastrophic breakdown, we're going to do that. I think that's been established already in our conversations. So that part, I don't have any problem with. I think that's just a matter of how we would make this happen. that we would, I agree with everything that's been said, that these drugs should have no place in racing. Because even the older horses, the studies they've done have been related to navicular bone radiographic changes, and is probably not suitable for use in a racehorse, period. So it is and should be a banned substance in all racehorses. It's a question of how do you detect it that is being used.
Okay. Sounds like Tom and I have some work to do. All right, on to LASIX. And one thing I want to mention before we get into here, the way that I had originally put this, the 3-year thing was my idea. And Tom supported it. That's what they're doing in Washington is, I believe it's between 3 and 4 hours. Maybe Dr. Lombard knows, but I was thinking, I'm sorry?
I'll check.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe it made sense, 4 hours isn't quite enough time. 5 hours seems like too much. Maybe split the difference and make it 4.5 hours.
The problem you're going to have in that situation when you make it 3 hours, everybody's going to want to be 3 hours and 15 minutes at the
Well,
most.
that's not going to happen no matter what. It's always going to be a problem.
Well, especially Dr. Jensen complained to me several times last year about everybody wants to be at the minimum amount of time that they can possibly be, because really for the LASIX to be the most effective for what they're trying to accomplish, it should be an even shorter time than that, because it's cleared very rapidly from the horse's system.
All right. So Dr. Everman, since we're starting with you, why don't you go ahead and talk about the 250 and then we'll go on to the other vets and then go backward from there.
Well, we need, when we have the dosage reducing from 500, which is 10 cc's, to 250, which is 5 cc's, I could see making that 6 cc's, which would be 300 milligrams, but I didn't see, they have to turn in a LASIX report to me of all the horses that get LASIX at the racetrack. So the veterinarian that administers this just before the race, in our previous rules, it was 4 to 5 hours prior to the race time. So they turn in a sheet to me that specifies how much they gave and when they gave it. And I didn't see any horses getting 10 cc's. So I don't think we're going to hurt the horses or the horsemen by reducing it somewhat on the maximum dosage allowable. The other problem we have is that all of our races in Oregon are run during the summer, and giving a diuretic prior to racing is going to mainly affect dehydration rather than bleeding. Now, it is going to affect and reduce bleeding from the lungs. Unfortunately, a very high percentage of horses are running on this because of the weight loss that occurs from fluid loss from the body and dehydration. So the horses are running maybe 40 pounds lighter than they were without the LASIX. And so all the horsemen, and approximately 90%, over 90% of the horses are running on LASIX, and not that many bleed. We had 4 horses bled last year, and of the 4 that bled, 3 were on LASIX. So not only does it not completely prevent bleeding, but there's a lot of horses that are running on LASIX strictly for the weight loss aspect rather than bleeding aspect.
Dr. Lombard.
Well, I completely disagree with Dr. Everman on the weight loss part of things. But the LASIX in and of itself, I don't believe does harm. We have horses running all over the country in different jurisdictions that are much hotter, that are hotter for longer periods of time, that run up to 10 cc's of LASIX. It is true that not very many of our horses are getting more than 5 or 6 cc's of LASIX on race day. The ones that need more are the ones that need more. We had 5 catastrophic breakdowns or catastrophic deaths between 2014 and 2018 that were exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. Those were horses that bled. But that have been prevented with Lasix in those particular horses? I don't know. But to limit horses who are bleeders is, I feel, doing harm. And why limit that? I'm trying to see what the purpose is in putting a restriction on treating a horse that's potentially a bleeder when it needs it. And as Dr. Everman said, most horses aren't getting more than that anyways, but the ones who need it, need it. And one of those exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage deaths that we had at Portland Meadows, I wake up in the middle of the night still. That jockey almost died because the horse went to the outside fence, hit the fence, and toppled down to its knees. And that horse, anecdotally, completely, but that horse had switched barns. The new barn, the horse had been claimed. The new barn did not know how to treat that horse appropriately because they didn't know it was a bad bleeder. And that horse got 5 cc's of Lasix that day. It had been running on 10. It's an anecdote, I know it is, but it's the reality that some horses do need more Lasix than 250 or 300 milligrams. The other difference is that's a milligram dosage, not a weight dependent dosage. So in most medications, we dose mg per kg. You know, how big is the horse? Some of our horses are little 900-pound skinny, not skinny, but you know, slight thoroughbreds. And we have some 1,600-pound quarter horses. That's, you know, almost twice as big. So to limit it by milligrams when you're treating mg per kg doesn't quite fit for me. And that's why I think changing it's going to do more harm than good.
Dr. Manhart.
I tend to agree a little more with Dr. Everman on this, and that's just in my experience over the years, but my experience is only at Grants Pass in the hot summer, and typically we never gave more than 5 cc's of Lasix ever, and often if it's a very hot day, we only give 3. So there has to be a dehydration factor in there as well, and it kind of messes up electrolytes and things for working muscles and that type of thing as well. But you know, I hadn't thought about, you know, the big heavy horses versus the slider horses or things like that. It was more who needed more or less type of thing. But yeah, I've really never ever given more than 5 myself personally, because we're trying to diurese. So.
And Miss Erickson.
Well, I am not in favor of Lasix at all. I'm not a veterinarian, so I don't have that level of knowledge. It just seems kind of counterintuitive to me to run my very hardest when I'm dehydrated. That doesn't make sense to me. And I wonder about the comfort level of the horse in that situation. And the other thing is, if we're going to use Lasix, it seems to me that a horse should be a known bleeder before we use Lasix on that horse. And I'm also in favor of getting known serious bleeders out of racing. Let them go do something else. I am not in favor of Lasix. If veterinarians can convince me that it's really beneficial to the horse, then I'll acquiesce. But I'm not keen on it at all.
Hang on.
Okay.
Let me just go ahead and get to everybody else, and then we'll go back to, we'll start with Dr. Manhart and then Dr. Lombard, and then we'll open up to everybody. Randy Bodine.
Yeah, so I do want to jump back to something and I believe what Dr. Lombard said in our last meeting is you also got to take into account when a horse does bleed, there's actual damage that occurs. And that damage is not just to get over in a couple of days and the horse is all better. That damage can carry over way further into the horse's life and career. And so if Lasix prevents that damage from ever happening, then I think it's a good thing. I mean, that's why Lasix has always been in the category of therapeutic rather than performance enhancing, is because it does prevent a serious situation from ever happening. certainly I recognize what Dr. Everman's saying. If there are horses that are being given it, even that probably don't need it, then I don't think that that's a necessarily good thing. But I also think that if you suspect or think that there's a possibility that the horse might bleed, you're preventing the horse from entering into a potentially damaging situation. And that's better for everybody. The horse, obviously, at the front of that list. So that's where I'm at with the use of Lasix. I'm not sure that going below the 500 is necessary at this point. But Dr. Everman said if we get to up, you know, from 10 to CCs down to 5 or 6, that makes, you know, I mean, that they're at least still in the ballpark. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. And then from one of the trainers that I've talked to, I think that that's kind of where they're at too. It's, you know, let's do the right thing for the horse. So.
Mr. Nelson.
I would, now let me get over here. Am I on or off? I think, ready to go. Okay. There was old research, and I don't know, the veterinarians could comment on that, that approximately 50% of the horses had a propensity for bleeding during a race. So if we're going to throw out 50% of the horses, I don't think it's good for racing. The primary thing that I would comment on is that quarter horses were explicitly exempted from HISA, and I think furosemide was probably one of the factors that there could be no agreement on. The primary, I think, as Dr. Everman said, that a high percentage of horses are on Lasix, and I think that that's a response to the commission's penalties for having a bleeding horse and going to the test barn with a bleeding horse, that they have staggered penalties from 6 months to life that the horse is subject to, or that the trainer is subject to for the horse. And I don't think that we want to take out those horses or that percentage of horses because trainers were taking the position that I don't want to take the risk of my horse bleeding in the test barn and being eliminated from competition for an extended period of time. So I don't know that that makes any great sense to lower the threshold, the dosage level from 500 to 200. Yeah, I think that gives some leeway. I think you have to keep in mind that the primary reason for giving the commission the latitude to establish tolerances was because of the increased sensitivity of testing back in the late part of the last biennium, or the last century, I guess. So the commission was given the authority to say set tolerances for these medications, and then the actual level of those applications, I think, is between the trainer and his veterinarian or her veterinarian, and say, what does this horse really need? And then if it's to go beyond that, I think is just simply an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of curing.
All right, let's circle back to the doctors and then we'll open it to the commissioners for their questions. Dr. Manhart, I think you raised your hand first.
Well, I was just going to comment way back in the day, to get on Lasix, you did have to prove that you were bleeding either visually or you had to be scoped. And they wound up going more generalized because the expense of that was prohibitive, that it was just not seeming to be very, because like Tom said, Dr. Everman, we had 4 horses that bled last year, probably more blood that we didn't detect, but that's why they went to everybody doing Lasix. It didn't start out that way. Everybody did not do Lasix. You only did certain horses that demonstrated bleeding.
Dr. Lombard.
To answer or follow up with Randy's question, the study that we were talking about at our last discussion was the one that was done on standardbred racehorses in England, and they found that 57% of racehorses bled. And that was a study of more than 1,000 horses done it was published in 21. So that's looking at subclinical bleeders, which basically is a terrible term because it means they're not clinical, but really what it means is you're not seeing blood out of their nose. They are bleeding into their lungs, so they're either scoped or they will actually wash the lungs and look at the cells to see if there are red blood cells there from bleeding. And what we know is that subclinical, again, terrible term, subclinical bleeding does cause damage to the lungs. It causes inflammation and it makes these horses prone to pulmonary disease of different kinds, including pneumonia and things like that. It's a longer return to being able to be athletic. And all of these subclinical horses can be mitigated with Lasix. And so we're actually doing right by these horses. Now, to Dr. Manhart's point, no, we're not scoping all of these horses. We don't know necessarily which ones bleed. And I will say when I was a treating veterinarian at the racetrack, I didn't give any horses more than 5 or 6 cc's of Lasix unless I had a clinical reason to do so, either based on extreme poor performance, scoping them, or actually seeing the blood out of their nose. And we knew that those horses were bleeders. We go through the rest and rehab, get them back to racing, and then run them on the higher dose. I just still believe that lowering it to 250 milligrams is just, we're not doing any good. What good are we doing?
Okay, let's go back to the commissioners. Commissioner Barry.
Anybody know off the top of their head about the average number of starters in our races in Oregon this past year?
Last year, we didn't have the fall race meet. The last year I have full numbers for, and it was 700, but it should be, I would guess, about 1,200. Randy, does that sound about right?
Yes, I'm trying to think if I can find it.
Let's just go with 1,200.
All right.
Okay, 1,200 is a good number. So that's a very small fraction of the horses in the state of Oregon, right? In the whole state of Oregon, we can't find 600 more horses that won't bleed when we run them around a track. I guess I don't understand the argument that we're not going to be able to have horses to run if we don't have horses that bleed on the track. Anybody who wants to clarify that for me, I can be swayed with a reasonable argument, but I just don't understand why a horse that bleeds when it runs isn't a cull.
These horses are, from the day they're conceived, are meant to be racehorses based on their breeding, how they're raised, their lineage. You can't just go pull any horse out of a pasture and say, let's go for a run.
No, you can't, but I bet we could find 600 in the state of Oregon that we could put on a track and it'd run pretty well with proper conditioning.
I would question that, Commissioner Barry. I don't think you could find a third of that.
No, I would have to agree with that as well. And if you also look at the human side, human athletes also bleed, and they certainly don't put them on Lasix, and they do things like that. But the same number of human athletes bleed when they exert as well.
Any more questions for Commissioner Barry?
I guess I'm just very skeptical about an animal with a disability that has to be on a medication to do the thing it's bred, as you say, Dr. Lombard, to do. Racehorse seems to me ought to be able to race. And if it needs to take medication to do it, that just doesn't sound like a racehorse to me. That sounds like something you got to dope up to get around a track. I'm sorry for putting too fine a point on it, but I'm just not convinced that, hey, I wrestled in high school. I know a little bit about exercising dehydrated. It sucks. I don't like doing that to a horse. And nobody's presented the commission, as far as I know, with a good argument for why we need that. That's all I got. But I think you guys can hear, I'm just not real convinced that LASIK is a good idea.
Commissioner Fowler.
Did
Commissioner,
I unmute? I'm sorry, having trouble getting my finger on the button of this iPad. I don't have any questions. I appreciate the comments. I've just been listening. I don't have any questions. Thanks.
okay, let's go on to the next one.
Wait, I have a question for
Oh.
Dr. Everman, please.
Go ahead, please.
Dr. Everman, what do we know about the long-term effects of LASIX on horses? Let's say a horse has a long racing career, 3 or 4 or 5 years. Do we know how that affects them over time?
Well, I think we could generally say that it would not have a negative effect in the sense that LASIX is cleared from the system extremely rapidly. And the real question is whether giving the LASIX 3 to 5 hours prior to the racing actually will prevent bleeding. And there has been a study that questioned that somewhat. So we don't know what because you can't predict when a horse will bleed externally, that you could see it. Like I said, last year we had 4 horses that bled out the nose. There was visibly obvious bleeders, and 3 of the 4 were on LASIX. So how much good the LASIX is doing, we don't know. And especially with the time frame and the dosage that we establish in our rules. But long-term is probably not hurting the horses because it's a drug that's not given except when the horses race. And it's cleared very quickly from the system. As soon as they go back to the barn and drink some water, they're basically over it. So long-term is not an issue.
So does that mean that the reduction in bleeding symptoms actually comes from the level of dehydration the horse has rather than the drug itself still being in its system at the time of the race?
No, the bleeding occurs from pulmonary blood pressure being very high during the racing stress. And the LASIX actually does, they've measured this, it does lower the blood pressure in the pulmonary artery. Whether it helps with bleeding is very hard to say and hard to measure because you don't know which horse will bleed at which time and how much LASIX would be useful in preventing that. So the bigger problem I have with LASIX is just the dehydration that secondarily occurs, the loss of fluid from the body. LASIX is by definition a diuretic, and it causes fluid loss. It's used in people and dogs and every species of animal for edema or accumulation of fluid in the intercellular spaces. So LASIX is used mainly for other things. Heart failure is a perfect example in people where they accumulate extra fluid in their body, in their lungs, their legs, etc. And LASIX is given to help reduce this. But it also reduces the pulmonary artery blood pressure, and so by extrapolation is going to reduce bleeding from the lungs. Whether it does, there's one study that was not able to prove that it actually helped on that. So it's hard to say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that explanation.
All right, time to get dizzy again. So in summary of that last one, we may play around a little bit with the number, and Tom and I will work on that. It sounds like the commissioners are for this change. Generally speaking, we just need to see if we need to tweak the numbers at all. And that the medication that was discussed by Dr. Lombard, we do want to specifically call that out in here. All right, another one to discuss, racing plates, racing. And this one, you know, we may just decide to just throw it out right now. For any of you that don't know what's going on here, Mike, bless your heart, he has worked so hard on this and has come up with 3 different options. And in the process of all of his hard work, he's gotten the attention of HISA and ARCI and the Quarter Horse Association, who are all realizing that we have not done a good job, any regulating body, on defining exactly what we do on this. So with that, Mike, I'll let you give a little bit of history on this. I also would like to mention that the Quarter Horse Society just said that they're going to make a proposal, Quarter Horse Association, and I believe their proposal was for like 8 in the back, which is way higher than anybody else I've ever seen. And the ARCI is going to be looking at potential model rules in March, which may be a reason that we may not want to do anything with this right now. So I turn over to Mike to explain it.
Okay, what you're looking at here is kind of a punt. I had, like you mentioned, Connie, I had written a number of different rules, and everybody's all over the board. All over the board, like you were saying, 8 millimeters, the AQHA, Janet Van Bieber. And then HISA, you know, they were talking about just rim shoes. And now I guess talking to Randy Bodine, they're talking about going back to 2 millimeters toe grabs on the fronts. And maybe 4 in the back. I'm not sure, but after a while, I just threw something together and it's like, let's see what the stakeholders have to say, you know, and we'll go from there. I tried to get as close as I could with, you know, kind of a compromise with all the different, well, ideas and proposals. And so this is where I wound up with, and we'll just see what happens from here.
And we'll go around, but just so you see the old one, it just basically said front grab shall not exceed 4 millimeters. I don't even think it talked about.
No, it just talked about 4 grabs all the way around.
Yeah.
4 millimeters. So
All right.
the idea here was to go in the direction that we're wanting to go, but without overshooting. Like, for example, if HISA goes back the other direction, I don't want to overshoot what they're doing. So anyway, like I said, this is just a punt. We'll see what happens.
All right, let's go ahead and go around and see what everybody says. Let's go, this time let's go the opposite direction. Let's start with Dave.
Well, I'm with Mike on that. I think I've seen every kind of a shoe that's been possibly devised, used. The research that I've seen shows that horses, you know, most of the injuries are on front legs. Most of the horses slip a little as they land from a stride on the front, and that's part of the shock absorber system. So yeah, I've run them higher than 2. I've ground them down on the grinder to less than 2, till they're basically flat. And so yeah, I think that Mike's 2 and 4 is a reasonable compromise around the corner.
And Mr. Bodine.
So this is kind of where this 2 and 4 is sort of where I was. This is again, Mike's exactly right. I mean, everybody's all over the board on this thing. And in fact, this is a back off from where HISA was at one point. They were less than this, and then they came back to this, which is sort of typical for them. But they've so this is, to the best of my knowledge, this is where they're at right now. Not that I'm advocating them, but reasonable is exactly the right word. I think Mike did a good job on this, and 2 and 4 is gonna be all right.
Mike, you may have a home run here. And Miss Erickson.
Well, I'm in favor of the horse's stride being as normal and natural as possible. I'm not in favor of high toe grabs that would reduce the slide so much that it increases the concussion up the horse's leg. But I can also see the benefit of the slide at speed not being so extreme that the horse injures itself because of that. So this sounds to me like a reasonable compromise. And then trainers can make their own decisions on their own horses, what they think, if it doesn't need toe grabs or if it does. I'm okay with this.
All
Connie,
right.
Could
Yes.
I ask Mike a question? Does
Uh,
the traction devices include in your reading of that, does that include nails as well? I've seen some
No.
pretty high nail heads.
No, that question came up a while back. You talking about mud nails?
Yeah.
I don't see those as traction devices. So at the bottom of this rule, I defined what I thought would be considered traction devices.
Okay.
Bends, cocks, stickers, that kind of thing. I left toe grabs off of it because obviously we're allowing toe grabs according to the other part of the rule, right? So I left some of that out and just defined what I thought traction devices would be. And that could be altered, like I said, this is
Yeah.
just a punt. So
all right, let's go down to our veterinarians, Dr. Everman.
Well, I think the biggest problem, I like this the way it's written. It's pretty simple. We don't have at this point a inspector, a plate inspector that's going to check these anyway and measure them. So it may be a moot point at this juncture. But the biggest variation we have is the track surfaces and the weather conditions. And these affect how the shoes are going to perform on the surface. And I've talked to hundreds of farriers in my day, and they basically do what the horsemen want. And they may make some suggestions, but it's going to be extremely variable. I like this rule the way it's written. I don't have a problem with it.
Dr. Manhart.
I like it too, but as Mike was talking about, maybe including what is like the nails are not included. So you may have that are not limited to bends and cocks and stickers, but are allowed nails and so that you would also say what was allowed.
Mike, make a note of that.
okay.
And Dr. Lombard.
Sorry, unmute. I like how it's written. I think it's great. I would just say if there's more discussion about this, 4 millimeters is still a little bit pushing it for me for biomechanics. So I hope that it wouldn't go any higher than 4 millimeters should this get revised and working through it. But how it's written, I approve. I like.
Mike, you got a winner. Winner, chicken dinner. Just a little more detail. All right, commissioners, it's open to you for questions.
I have no questions. I'll just give Mike an attaboy and echo Executive Director Wynn.
Thank you.
Commissioner.
I don't have any questions either. Great.
Cool. Easy. Okay, this is a big one. Post-mortem examination / necropsies. I've had some people say we're going to call them necropsies and some people call them post-mortem examinations. So I'm going to let the veterinarians fight this out. And if both, one or the other is the best. We did try to change this up. The idea is when we can, we want to get a necropsy. It's one of my pet peeves. I'm sorry. I just think it's important. All horses that die or are euthanized on the Oregon Racing Commission's jurisdiction track grounds shall have a post-mortem examination performed when reasonably feasible. There may be a time where it's in the middle of the night and there's absolutely nobody that can take the horse there, and we'll deal with that if that happens. And this gives us a backup because you never know. I mean, there could be snow on the pass in July, who knows? Necropsy should be performed at facilities and by personnel with capacities to perform necropsy examinations of race horses. And I know, Tom, I'm not sure if we got that language the way you wanted it or not. If a necropsy is not obtained, a post-mortem examination will be conducted by the ORC veterinarian. The ORC Racing Commission will reimburse the racetrack for reasonable cost of transportation and will pay for all costs of the necropsy. Relationships and contact information shall be included in the necropsy standard operating procedure. The veterinarian performing the necropsy shall not be an attending veterinarian of the affected horse. All right, let's start with the veterinarians. Dr. Everman.
Well, I think the way it's written is fine. I don't have a problem with using both terms in there. My only objection was using the term autopsy. So if you have necropsy and postmortem examination, both written in the rule like it is in this case, I think that's fine. And we should have direct contact in addition to our form with the laboratory at Oregon State that's going to be performing the necropsy. And what we are requesting in that examination should be specified. Now, if we don't have refrigerated transportation and it happens in the summer and we're multi-hours away, we recognize that internal organs will probably not be viable for laboratory analysis, especially liver. So we need to specify what we want them to do. And certainly, I think it can be good for the Racing Commission and for horsemen in general to know what was wrong with the horse, not only a catastrophic injury and potentially euthanasia, but what else was wrong with it. It could be a real eye opener and a helpful thing, a bit of information for everyone involved.
Dr. Manhart.
A question for Tom. Does this include like a horse that dropped dead from colic or something like that in the stall? Or is this just under racing horses?
Well, I think this would be up to Connie. We would, I would defer to her if we had a horse. She and I talked about this earlier, that there are some horses at the racetrack that are not actually race horses. That might be an old horse that the people, because they're basically bringing all their horses to the racetrack because that's someone has to take care of this horse. There was one there last year. There was a blind horse that she just basically brought it with her. And if that horse died, I don't think the Racing Commission would spend the money to do a post-mortem on that horse. If, for example, if it colicked and was put to sleep, then we just let that one go. And I would, ask Connie what she wanted to do in that situation, but probably it would only be race horses. And if they died of colic, we might have to do the post-mortem at the track, because shipping it, depending on where it was, the reason that it died might not be viable to make that determination hours later and in hot weather in the summer. So we might have to do that postmortem ourselves. So.
Yeah, and Dr. Manhart, my reasoning on this was, I noticed that several other jurisdictions did this, and when I talked to them, they said that they learned a lot from doing these, that some of the horses may had too many drugs in their system or other factors. It just is another way for us to gather more information on our horses in general, plus learn if there's anything else going on with these horses. That was the intent of that.
Okay. Oh, no, I'm totally on board with doing necropsies. That's fine. So no, it's, and putting it into the statutes is fine. I think it's a good thing. So.
And I think we decided that, a fair amount would be $1,200, to give the track to pay for that. Rod Lowe said it cost them about $1,000. We have not been paying that in the past, but that's something we can certainly do to help offset that. And then it's a little easier for everybody. Okay, Dr. Lombard.
I think this is great. I do have some verbiage questions and back to the postmortem versus necropsy. I don't know other vets. I guess in my mind, postmortem is not as extensive as a necropsy, and maybe that's just the verbiage or legal things in my head. Like is one or the other. So I guess the real question here is, if the necropsy, if we're doing this boots on the ground at the track because the feasibility of transport is difficult, are we sending samples of every single organ? How extensive is it? Are we looking at the contralateral limb, say it was an orthopedic breakdown, to evaluate that? Are we doing imaging? Whereas if we're at the university setting, it's a much more controlled environment and they have that, SOP of what they always do. And then if they find something, they offer additional evaluations and examinations. I just want to be clear of what we're, if it is midnight at Prineville and we're trying to save organs or not save organs, we are doing right by the intent of this, because I think this is great and I think we should be doing this. But if we can't get it to OSU, what are we doing? And then the next question is also, if the university is doing the necropsy and the racing commission is facilitating it all, just release of records to the owner of the horses, all the findings then still transparent, I guess is the question, between the horsemen.
They post them on their site in California, or at least a summary of them.
Yeah, so that's another important question.
All right. Do you have any answers to any of those questions, Dr. Everman?
Well, I think that in this case, the Oregon Racing Commission is doing the postmortem. So the records are ours, not the horse owners. So it is, for educational purposes alone, it's worth letting everyone know what was wrong with this horse. Especially like you said, on a contralateral limbs. We had one last year that a postmortem was done and it showed the horse it broke down a fetlock, but it had significant injury to the other fetlock as well. And the horse had never been lame, either in a pre-race exam or after a race. It had never been on a vet's list, but still its fetlocks were significantly damaged. I think the horse was 5 years old. So the postmortems are valuable. I'm completely on board with this plan.
All right, and let's go to everybody else. Connie.
I'm 100% in favor of this, and if the language needs tweaking just a little bit, I'll leave that to people who know more about necropsies and postmortems, our veterinarians. I personally would like to obtain a copy of the report if it were my horse. And we did have a horse breakdown in training at Emerald Downs a few years ago. And I spoke with and got information from the veterinarian that did the necropsy. And, it didn't help heal the heart, but I think hopefully most owners as well as trainers would want to know what went wrong. And if we can learn anything to help future horses, I think this is absolutely fundamentally necessary.
And let's go with David this time. Dave Nelson.
No, I think I think the intentions are good on this, as long as there is good communication between Dr. Everman and the laboratory wherever it's done. You know, you guys know better than I, do they have the capacity to do a thorough necropsy at Oregon State? I know Howard Gelberg has left and gone to Texas, and he was the one who did the necropsy on a foal I had some years ago. So as long as there's good communication between Dr. Everman and the laboratory, I think it's fine.
Randy Bodine.
Yeah, I'm totally in support of this. I would request that all of Dr. Everman's suggestions be incorporated into this too. I listened to what he had to say, and I think some of that language should come into this. And also what Connie said, I think I don't have a problem with it being public for anybody to look at, but I would like to see a copy go to the owner if it's possible. It isn't too much of a problem for the commission to do so. I just think it, you know, from an owner's or trainer standpoint, it would be a helpful tool to have in your hand. So.
Absolutely. All right, and Mike, do you have any comments on this? Mike Twiggs?
No, I'm good. I'll leave it to the experts.
And Commissioner Barry, I almost made you a doctor, Commissioner.
Nope. All looks good to me. Tweak the language as necessary. Good job, guys.
And Commissioner Fowler.
I think it's great. I agree there needs to be some language change so that we're not footing the bill for necropsies of any horse that might be on the grounds that isn't racing. But other than that, I think it looks great.
All right. The good
I
news
do
is-
still think that race horses on the grounds that die should still have a necropsy, whether the euthanasia or death occurs because of or in the event of racing. If a horse is on the backside at the racetrack and is a racehorse, they should still have a necropsy. Not our pony horses, not our companion horses, whatever, but
yeah,
my
And-
opinion.
and we
And I would
corrected-
agree with that as well.
We corrected that language. I had originally failed to put the word race in when I first submitted it, and Dr. Everman quickly brought that to my attention, as he should. And that's revised, and Dr. Everman, I will touch base before the commission meeting to try to put some final tweaks on here, and I know that if you want to talk to me and go over this again before our next commission meeting, Commissioner Barry, you'll be reporting on Thursday. Are there any final comments? I think this was, I want to tell everyone how much I appreciate the collaboration and the collegiate environment on this. I think that we've come a long way from where we were. We came up with some compromises, and we've rewritten some things. I think we're really close to moving forward with this. So everybody should give themselves a huge round of applause, and hopefully we can get this up and running. Any other comments? Have a great day. I'll talk to you later.